Yesterday, the UN Security Council held a meeting on attacks from ISIS against LGBT people in the Middle East. UN Ambassador Samantha Power talked to reporters after the meeting, where she was joined by a Syrian refugee who spoke before the Security Council.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with Supi, who just spoke to the first ever meeting of the Security Council on LGBT rights and issues. I'll just say a few words and then open it up for questions, and feel free to direct your questions to Supi here. It was a very moving meeting. The attendance was, I would say, excellent and cross-regional. The testimonies that Supi and a gentleman who went by the pseudonym of Adnan offered left people, I think, gripped and moved. Everybody has read about what ISIL and what others are doing to LGBT people around the world, but it's another thing entirely to hear personal testimonies. While others spoke, including members of the Security Council and other member states, photos also were projected that depicted what ISIL is doing to LGBT persons or those suspected of being LGBT. And so if ever anybody was tempted to drift away or have their attention go elsewhere, the graphic, gut-wrenching photos of what is being done and the very real threat posed even as we sat in this meeting today in territory where ISIL is dominant. The last thing I would say is just that while some of the emphasis was on ISIL, particularly given the testimony of the witnesses, there was widespread recognition among those who speak that this is not an issue by any means confined to ISIL. Yes, it is true that ISIL has made it common practice, it seems, to target LGBT persons, but that is true also around the world, very far from where ISIL dominates. You have countries that have criminalized LGBT status. You have societies, of course, that are every bit as unwelcoming as they were, 20, 30 years ago, communities in that regard. But today's meeting is a sign that this issue is getting injected into the mainstream at the United Nations. 70 years into the UN's history, the last 5 years have seen some very important milestones here at the United Nations. Jessica Stern, the head of the LGBT organization that briefed, is the leader of an organization that for a very long time couldn't even get accredited to the United Nations. And we and a number of other countries fought for that accreditation. Had that accreditation not been achieved, she wouldn't have even been allowed into the meeting as an NGO. Now she's sharing systematic data and analysis of this phenomenon and this problem all around the world. We had never, before 5 years ago, had a resolution that even acknowledged LGBT rights as human rights. That resolution was passed in 2011. There's been a second Human Rights Council resolution, and now a report that was just issued in June of this year documenting the fate of LGBT persons, the plight of LGBT persons around the world. Again, we're getting this issue into the DNA of the United Nations, but until today, the Security Council had never broached this topic, and so today also represents a small but historic step. And with that, open it up for questions.
Great. Ali, why don't you start?
Thank you. Madam Ambassador, how is the United States going to address this issue, especially in the Middle East, in a more formal way or settings within the United Nations organs, especially in the Security Council? Thank you.
Well, again, today was an important step. It's an informal meeting of the Security Council, but in 70 years, no such meeting had happened before. And we heard, I'd say most of the countries who spoke made a point of noting how important it was that this conversation continue. NGOs were present in the meeting. Of course, we would have also opened the meeting up to the press, but for the issues of security related to one of our witnesses. And so, again, the precaution was taken to keep television cameras and press out of the meeting. Within the General Assembly, it was only, I think it was back in 2010, you might recall the General Assembly passed a resolution in which sexual orientation was initially omitted from the General Assembly resolution banning extrajudicial killings on a number of grounds. And the General Assembly actually voted to take out reference to sexual orientation. The United States mission and a number of other countries fought to get it put back in. That was not long ago. And that was deemed one of the very first successes, again, of integrating this issue. I've already mentioned the 2 resolutions that have been passed at the Human Rights Council. We just have to continue to create dedicated spaces and venues for conversations like the one we just had, raising awareness, showing LGBT people or those being persecuted that the UN cares, that the Security Council cares, that the General Assembly cares, that the Human Rights Council cares, that the member states of the United Nations care. That's extremely important. But also each of us as governments has a responsibility to inject the treatment of LGBT persons into our bilateral relationships as well. And I would note that I'm very proud that President Obama back in 2011 issued a presidential memorandum giving direction to all agencies in the U.S. government to inject LGBT rights into our foreign policy. That means in terms of asylum and refugee adjudication, which SUPI is an example, is now being factored in terms of who would gain asylum in this country. In terms of funding for human rights defenders and those who might defend any individual who's actually being, whose status is being criminalized in some way. Rapid response, so we can assist and provide material support again to those in need. And one of President Obama's directions was inject this into our multilateral diplomacy, which is what we have been doing. And so this is, again, we know how far we have to go, we know how long the road is, but I think if you look back as to where we were 5-10 years ago, already it's been much more integrated. This LGBT core group that exists here in New York expands in size every year. Secretary Kerry and I both attended LGBT ministerials at the UN General Assembly last year and the year before. Nothing like that had ever happened before. So again, making sure that the physical security, but also the dignity of LGBT persons is very much part of our agenda here, is a big priority for the United States.
Michelle, go ahead.
Thanks, Ambassador. On this particular issue of Islamic State attacks on LGBT in Iraq, Syria and elsewhere, given that 2 members of the Security Council didn't show up today to this meeting, what more do you think the Council can do on this particular issue? And just on another subject, can you update us on the negotiations on the South Sudan arms embargo draft?
I think on South Sudan, I just say the negotiations are ongoing, and it's more important, I think, at this moment to focus on President Kiir and his government and ensuring that they sign on to an agreement that the entire world has rallied around. In terms of what else the Security Council can do, I think venues like this one are available to us. We've proven it can be done. It can secure widespread attendance, that witnesses are willing to come forward and tell their stories. And, you know, we can look at venues like this one again. I think that publicizing also the June report by the Human Rights Council is extremely important, because that's the first time the UN has really, the second time the UN has documented, again, the status of kind of state of the world for LGBT persons. And so ensuring that Security Council members give that report and the welfare of those individuals lift and amplify that report, I think is really important. But also, you know, when we're talking about a particular country, we often, each of us, talk about human rights or the crisis, let's say, faced by women and girls in conflict. We need to look and make sure our embassies and the United Nations are looking to see also how LGBT persons are being treated in particular conflict areas. And so ISIL is going to come up again, in many, many Security Council meetings, rest assured. When it comes up, it's also imperative that in addition to talking about the threat that ISIL posed to Christians, to Yazidis, to Shia, to any Sunni or anybody who doesn't share the warped ideology, to cultural artifacts of the kind that have been destroyed monstrously here in the last couple days. Alongside that, it is essential that the fate of LGBT persons also be raised and discussed, and we will work with our council partners and colleagues to ensure that it isn't just the United States raising it. You can see Chile's very strong leadership role, and again, the turnout, I think, was actually quite strong, and the statements were very strong from those who came.
Okay, Edie, please.
Thank you very much. Madam Ambassador, in terms of actually getting ISIL to stop these horrible killings and attacks, isn't the answer really to go after ISIL? And what is actually being done to go after them, particularly in Syria? We know what's happening in Iraq. And I wonder if Mr. Suhi could talk about what was your reaction to your presentation. Did you feel that you made a dent? What was your big message to these ambassadors?
Great. I'll just speak briefly, but I'm very glad, Edie, that you asked Supi a question, because I think he is the most valuable person here to hear from on all these matters. On ISIL, of course, we're waging, along with 60 coalition partners or now more, a sustained, multifaceted struggle to defeat this horrific organization. And I don't think anybody thinks that you can convince Baghdadi to be less hateful and violent to LGBT persons or women or girls or religious minorities, etc. They have to be defeated. And that, of course, has a military component. I think it's very important, too, that the arrangements that are being developed between the United States and the rest of the coalition and Turkey are going to, I think, greatly enhance our ability to blunt ISIL's efforts and set them back. And again, accelerate that process of degradation in northern Syria. But there are a lot of other components, many of which will be discussed at this coming General Assembly, which is, as always, a great occasion to check in on our progress and also look at the gaps and the things we still need to make progress on. The other facets are every bit as important as the military, and that's the foreign terrorist financing, the flows of foreign terrorist fighters, and the need to ensure that the borders are sealed and that data is being shared across boundaries. We already had the session here not long ago where Secretary Jay Johnson was in the chair for the United States. Extremely important that interior ministries are speaking to one another and again, enhancing their efforts. Public diplomacy, ISIL's use of social media, of course, is something that many have commented on. It's essential that people like Supi and some of the people that he grew up with and those who are stuck living under ISIL, or even those who were lured by the illusion that going to fight with ISIL would be a great romantic journey, that their stories are told about what life under captivity is like with ISIL. So there are a number of lines of effort, one of which is military, but I think this General Assembly, you'll see many of these lines of effort brought forward because defeating ISIL is something that is going to take time, but the degradation is something that we can accelerate every day, and mobilizing the international community around it. This really is an issue for all of the divisions in the international system that everybody can agree upon at the state level, and we need to take advantage of that. Over to Supi.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Ambassador. The message that I wanted to convey to the ambassadors that there in the chamber is LGBT people have their own voice, and LGBT people wanna be represented in the UN and in the government, and want to be integrated into the systems and be part of the development of the countries and its policies. So I was hoping that my message will deliver that integration of not just to prove that LGBT is not just a terminology invented by the West itself, but there is an LGBT community in the Middle East and in Africa, and they stand together and they want their right too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Can we do a
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.